Hello, this is Eddie G, DM Fumble, and this is another edition of Fumbling Around. And today I want to talk about something that is very important to me, and it is one of the reasons why I wanted to start this channel at this point, and it is getting ready for the new module that's about to come out, Shadow of the Dragon Queen. So if you're familiar with it, it is the next big adventure from Wizards of the Coast. It's going to be coming out in early December, and it is going to be the first module in 5th edition to take place in the Dragonlance setting. And if you're not familiar with the setting, this is one of a number of videos I want to do that'll help give you some basic, simple background information on things to be aware of that are unique and different about the Dragonlance setting versus some of the other ones, Greyhawk, Forgotten Realms, and what else is out there. So today I want to focus on races and creatures, and I want to focus on 3 major areas. The first area are the races and creatures that are common in other settings, but for one reason or another do not really appear in the Dragonlance setting. Second, I want to focus on the races and creatures that we don't really know if they fit into the Dragonlance setting or not. They just haven't been in stories, and they haven't been officially declared as part of the setting or not, one way or the other. Lastly, I want to focus on the races and creatures that are unique to Krynn, things that are not really seen in the other settings. So with that in mind, let's strap in, and we're going to start talking about the races and creatures of Dragonlance setting. Okay, so the first area that I want to talk about are the races and creatures that are common in other settings, but are not actually found on Dragonlance. The first one is one of the most well-known. It's the fact that there are no halflings in the Dragonlance setting, and those are replaced by another race that we'll talk about later called the Kender. And that was for reasons that they wanted to kind of break away, I think, from the other tropes and Tolkienism of those particular creatures. And they wanted to have something that was a little bit less geared towards thieves and thievery as they were defined in the earlier editions of D&D. Another race that you'll not find on Dragonlance are orcs, and by extension, half-orcs. The creators of the setting, Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman, posted a recent article online that I'll link to in the show notes as to why they chose to move away from that. And again, it goes back towards the history of orcs as they come to us from the traditions of J.R.R. Tolkien, and how they wanted to create something that was, again, something very different. And they do have a kind of analog in their original trilogy, which we'll talk about later. The last one that is mentioned is one that has a bit of a debate among people, and that is drow. And by that I mean the dark-skinned, white or silver-haired people that look like the Drizzt Do'Urden type. Some of the earliest Dragonlance products actually do mention drow as those type of creatures, and it was really kind of as they were still kind of forming the world and kind of before they made decisions about what to include, what not to include. Later on, they decided there really isn't a large Underdark setting, so there's no really realm for them to live and thrive in. So drow as that term and that race that we know doesn't exist on Krynn. Now, books will later mention what they call a dark elf, and that's not the same as a drow. In the Dragonlance setting, dark elves refer to a disgraced elf, a disgraced surface elf, one that maybe has fallen out of favor with their elven houses or governments, whatever it may be. So while the term exists, it really refers to a different set of circumstances in Dragonlance versus the other settings. Now, those are the big 3: halflings, orcs, and drow. There's also a couple of other minor ones that some people aren't aware of, so I'll include that for the sake of completeness for this portion of the video. And that is lycanthropes. There are no lycanthropes, no werewolves, were-rats, were-tigers, were-foxes, were-ravens, were-whatever. They don't exist. And I've been trying to do some research as to why they don't exist, and there's no definitive answer. My thought is that maybe they had a reason tied to the moons. Usually with were creatures, they have a forced triggered transformation based on the full moon. Well, in Dragonlance, there are actually 3 moons. So is it, which of the 3 moons? There's a moon of goodness, basically a moon of neutrality, and a moon of evil. Which one of those moons triggers it? And then that causes other complications down the line. For the longest time, I didn't include those in my game, but I really like were-rats for whatever reason. So I've kind of had to work out a logical system in my head as to why I've done that. And I'm actually writing an article for my blog, and I'll include a link to that in the show notes as well, if you want to read on my justification on how a moon of Krynn could support lycanthropes. So, in addition to that, giants do not exist, with one caveat. Hill giants exist, but larger giants such as the frost giants, fire giants, and so forth, those are said not to exist. And again, I don't know why, but it's been stated in the 3.5 Dragonlance DM screen, which has a great little resource of creatures that are applicable and not applicable, and that's where they definitely talk about how hill giants are there, other types of giants are not. They might be one-off creatures, a one-off fire giant, in a volcano mountain or whatever, but you're not going to have a large enough colony to see them as a race of creatures. Another one that you won't see in Dragonlance are beholders. They've said, again, in that same resource, the Dragonlance DM screen, that beholders don't exist. Again, except as a one-shot type of creature, meaning that instead of having a whole race of beholder types, they've given an example, actually, in that book, where they have a cursed human wizard who is cursed into this, abomination shape of one eye with the eye stalks and so forth. So it does give a great example of how you can take some creatures that you might not want to bring in all the baggage associated with beholders and, underdarks and lairs and colonies and plots to take over the world, that kind of thing. And if you want to just have one in, bring it in as a one-off kind of cursed creature type element that you could easily incorporate into Dragonlance without having to bring in all this extra baggage and change the setting too much. So, beholders. Lastly, or actually 2 more on the list that I have here, mind flayers. Mind flayers do not exist on the Dragonlance setting. The biggest reason I would think is that they don't want to have to bring in psionics. Psionics definitely do not feel very Dragonlance-y, which is very magic oriented, and psionics might cause other issues with the power curve of the setting, especially during some of its back history. So again, no mind flayers, but with the multiverse and portals and things like that and spell jamming now, it's very easy again to bring them in through outside interference, if you will. Lastly, we have the outsiders, the demons, the devils, and by extension, what they used to call the half-fiends or the half-celestials. We might now call them tieflings and Aasimars. Those don't exist. Those don't exist on Krynn in any large numbers. Again, the setting is very good and evil at the human level, with maybe some influence of the gods, but bringing in the demons and the devils maybe goes against some of the original design principles. I myself personally include those in my games as mid-level boss foes that the players have to overcome and learn about and defeat and so forth. But again, in the official setting, those creatures do not exist. The next area that I want to talk about are the races and creatures that are not mentioned as being part of the Dragonlance setting, and we don't really know how they fit in. And for that, I'm thinking about creatures and races that were introduced in later editions. For example, you can have Fearbolgs, which are kind of a giantkin type, but not as large as the largest giants, which we know don't exist. So they could be easily incorporated. Things like the Kenku, the Tabaxi, those I think are part of a group of races and creatures that are really easy to bring in by just knowing a little bit of the geography and just saying, okay, they come from a more remote part of the continent that most people aren't familiar with, and there's not a lot of immigrants from there onto the mainland or the part where you guys are at. So while there might be a Tabaxi player, maybe there aren't a whole bunch of Tabaxi running around in whatever city you're at or village. And it might be dealing with that kind of, this is a unique person or a unique creature. How do we deal with that as they encounter, people that have never seen one before? So that could create some really interesting role-playing opportunities. Again, for some of these creatures, it's just easy enough to say they come from elsewhere and bring them in, let them run around in the Dragonlance setting. Some of them bring a little bit more baggage with them, and with that, work with the DM and figure out how it works. For example, in my current campaign, I have a player who wanted to play Warforged, and there really aren't Warforged on Dragonlance. They're from the Eberron setting. But after doing some research and reading up on them, I was able to realize that they were created as soldiers for the war, the last war. I believe they call it Eberron. And since my campaign is taking place just after the War of the Lance, I realized I could have had the same thing happen on Krynn. Krynn is the world in the Dragonlance setting. I could have had the same thing happen on Krynn, where towards the end of the war, in need of extra troops, they decided to come up with this Project Warforged, I call it, where they figured out how to create these sentient mechanical creatures. And in my version, they only created about a dozen or so, maybe 24. So again, there aren't a lot of Warforged running around, and this player has one of the few that's still operational. So that was an easy way to bring in some of that lore and easily incorporate it into the Dragonlance setting. I have another player playing a Kalishtar, which required me to do a little bit more research and figure out how I wanted to incorporate it into Dragonlance as part of a storyline involving, more of the gods and more of the overall cycle of darkness and light. I thought those themes played very well within the Dragonlance setting, even though Kalishtar are not part of that. So, again, you and your DM might be able to find ways where you can easily incorporate these other races that maybe do have a little bit more of a storyline that you have to bring along, or maybe just reskin them in a way that takes out some of that capability and leaves some of it still intact, so you get the flavor of the Kalishtar, but maybe not with all the storyline that's required for them. So, again, really it's just figuring out with your DM's approval what's allowed, where could these people have come from, how are they interacting with the world now, and how best to use those unique creatures in telling very interesting stories that otherwise you couldn't do with just regular dwarves and elves and so forth. So for the final topic I wanted to talk about, I wanted to look at the races and creatures that are new or different in Dragonlance versus some of the other settings. The first one I want to talk about are gnomes, and I want to put a little asterisk here and go back and talk about the full evolution of gnomes in Dungeons & Dragons. Gnomes, when they were originally introduced, were a race of creatures that leaned towards illusions, being illusionists and illusion magic. If you remember, the older settings used to have a preferred class for each of the races, and the gnomes were the illusionists. In Dragonlance, they took a very different approach. They said, no, they're not really that, and they said that gnomes are tinkerers. They build devices. with various levels of success. And that's a different story for another day. But they gave them a totally different take versus the traditional gnome in AD&D back then. As the game progressed through second edition, 3.5, and so forth, we saw the gnomes, the standard gnomes of those editions, take on more of the traits of what we call the Tinker Gnomes. The Tinker Gnomes are mentioned in the complete book of Halflings and Gnomes from second edition, and later on, again, they're given more and more of these traits, so that even by fifth edition version, we have what are called the rock gnomes that are basically the Tinker Gnomes of Dragonlance. So I mention them as a asterisk in that they were very much different from the standard D&D gnome, but the D&D gnome has really shifted more towards being like a Dragonlance gnome. And of course, in 5th edition, there are other types of gnomes that really do have some of those older traits associated with them. Now comes the most infamous one, Kender. I say infamous. If you're not familiar with Kender, then you are lucky. As a longtime Dragonlance fan, I have seen message boards of people talking about how much they dislike and hate Kender, and for one reason or another. Kender as a race are basically young. They're described as being almost teenage-like, with a wide-eyed, gleeful look at the world, and a wanderlust that has them searching around and experiencing all kinds of new things to see and try and do in life. And one of the things they have is they don't seem to have a sense of fear. So that normal preservation instinct that keeps us from sticking our hand in the fire again and again and again, gnomes don't, or I'm sorry, the Kender don't seem to have that, and they do it over and over and over for the excitement. Or they'll run into a dragon's lair just to see what the dragon looks like, not at all cautious of the fear of the dragon, breathing fire on them and obliterating them in the first instance of the encounter. That has led some, or in my experience, I've seen stories or read stories where it has led some people to take the no fear, chaotic nature, mindlessly thieving from anyone, including party members, and really kind of abuse that in a way that wasn't really the goal of the game. So I've always found that I don't think Kender are a bad race. I think players, or bad players, have latched on to Kender as a free pass to do whatever kind of, game abuse they might want to do. I've had games where I've had people playing Kender, and we have kind of talked through in session 0 and ongoing how we can keep the Kenderness of that race, but without being something that's going to derail the game, break the game, have them stealing healing potions or whatever. That's really not the way the Kender should be portrayed. Definitely, reconsider Kender. I think they're a really fun race. There's a lot you can do with it. That wide-eyed, childlike innocence, especially when confronted with something as horrific as, a real war-torn scenario like we're going to see in Shadows of the Dragon Queen and the overall War of the Lance, or other events. Again, in my current campaign, I have a person playing a Kender, and the Kender survived a dragon onslaught. The entire village was destroyed. All of his friends were destroyed in dragon fire right in front of his face. And from time to time, he has these images of the final vision of what his friends looked like when they died from the dragon fire, and it kind of plays a nice counterbalance to his otherwise playful, jovial nature. So again, the race definitely has potential, and there's a lot of good you can do with it. You just have to work to find the ways to incorporate it into the structure of the game, which you should be doing with whatever character you're playing. How can that character best play into the story, not, push at the seams and break what your DM is trying to do? Okay. Minotaurs. Minotaurs are a race that a long-standing tradition in Dungeons and Dragons, and in Dragonlance they're a little bit different. In Dragonlance, they're not the monstrous creatures that are hiding in mazes and, the one-off, cursed men or whatever they might be. In Dragonlance, they're actually a true race. So there's males and females. They breed true Minotaur babies, and they have a whole tradition and history associated with the Dragonlance setting. In the Dragonlance setting, they are very much the pirates of the open seas. They also have a strong naval military and strong military force in general. They have a very strong code of honor. Some people would say that they're basically Klingons with horns. You can certainly work better ways to incorporate that, but they do have a personality and a lot of history that you can really latch onto that makes them different from the standard Minotaurs. Also, they're a little bit smaller, so you can easily, they're smaller size and less powerful, so that you can easily play them as a first level character. And this goes all the way back to the original AD&D Dragonlance Adventures hardback when they introduced that race as a playable race in there. So those are the three big ones. Basically the evolution of gnomes in the setting, Kender and Minotaur. Some other ones that are interesting. Well, obviously the biggest one is the Draconians. So introduced in the original trilogy, the Chronicles trilogy, the Draconians are basically the answer to, an evil force using an elite shock troop type of creature. The Draconians fit that bill. And we've seen Draconians again from the first edition through second, third, even fourth edition that didn't even have a Dragonlance setting per se, had some Draconians in, I believe it's the Draconomicon for fourth edition, as well as fifth edition with the recently released Fizban's Treasury of Dragons incorporates the Draconians, as well as in that book it also explains how you can have Draconians on any world. So that's a very interesting way of taking something very Dragonlance specific and showing how it is available in any setting you want to incorporate them in. Should be noted that Draconians are not Dragonborn. Dragonborn came later in the development of it. But Draconians are a little overpowered as a player race. I believe in third edition you actually could play Draconians, or at least some of the types. If I was running a game today where someone said they wanted to play a Draconian, I would basically reskin Dragonborn and let them use that as a power level appropriate type of creature, and work in some logical reasons as to why they're a little bit different from other Draconians of their own type. So in addition to the creatures that we talked about, there are various bestiaries. There was a bestiary in 3.5 edition, even the Saga edition, which is a completely separate rule set, but it has descriptions of the creatures, and the old Monsters Compendium. Number 4, I think, was Dragonlance specific, and then a lot of those got rolled into the hardback and later versions of the second edition rule set. Those have very specific Dragonlance creatures that are very easily portable to other realms. There's underground creatures that can easily go into any type of Underdark setting. In fact, I think I've seen a creature called a Disser appear in other adventures that were not Dragonlance specific. Lastly, I'll point out there is a creature called a Witchlin, and they are an undead creature. They are, I believe, an undead remnant of elves. It's really just the glowing eyes and skeletal hands floating in the air. And I know I read them in a Forgotten Realms, one of the handbooks of one of the major cities. Might have been the Waterdeep city or the Baldur's Gate city for the Forgotten Realms, where they even call out this is a witchland originally from the Dragonlance setting, appearing in this location and so forth. So it was interesting to see a Dragonlance very specific creature being pulled into another setting. It was one of the first times I had seen that. So again, it's very easy to pull in other monsters and creatures from other settings, especially some of the more beast and monstrous types. Just bring them in there, and again, look at those other resources, bestiaries and so forth, for creatures that are unique to the Dragonlance setting, beyond the humanoids that we've talked about. So with this, I've hopefully given you enough information about the types of creatures that are not available in Dragonlance, unless there's some extra work done. The ones that we're not so sure about, and you can work with your DM to figure that out, and then the ones that are very specific to Dragonlance and give you a very Dragonlance feel. So hopefully, armed with this information, you'll be able to guide your Shadow the Dragon Queen or whatever Dragonlance game you're going to run, and have a very Dragonlance experience and very a feeling of the Dragonlance setting, especially for people who've read the books and want to, kind of walk in the footsteps that the heroes of the Lance did, either through the settings or through some of the creatures that they interact with. Finally, I'm going to do other videos looking at other areas of Dragonlance, such as the unique classes of the Dragonlance setting. We'll look at some of the unique cities and locations for the setting, and then we're going to obviously spend some time looking at the unique gods of the setting, which really help give it some of its flavor. I want to thank you for watching this video. Hopefully you'll consider liking and subscribing to the channel, as I hope to continue posting more content on Dragonlance and Dungeons & Dragons. And with that, thank you for your time.